for Dr. Fielder, and we will now share the screen for Jeff Dautrich. And we'll unmute Jeff, or he'll unmute himself. And he's got 45 minutes to tell him everything he knows about food preservation. But I'll give a brief introduction. I know Jeff from the Gunnison Farmers Market, where he has been a customer of mine, but he's been in the Gunnison Valley. He lives in CB South and has been fermenting food for a very long time. And I'm just happy that I got to know him. And the most awesome thing is he's given me some of his ferments, and they are to die. I couldn't wait to get Jeff to give us a presentation, and maybe this will be the first of many as he shares some incredible knowledge with all of us. And I don't know, Jeff, I'm not talking about the work you do with your appliance business, because I'm all about food today, but I know you do a lot for the Valley in many ways. So I'll be quiet and I'll turn it over to Jeff Dautrich.
Well, thank you for that glowing introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Fielder. That was an awesome presentation. I'm assuming you can hear me and everything?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Jeff Dautrich, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I have learned about food preservation and specifically fermenting. I'm going to go through some different types of food preservations and just kind of touch on a few things. If you have questions, please write them down, present them at the end of the meeting. I'll take them then. So food preservation is a natural extension of the current trend to growing your own food in this climate of uncertainty and our quest for more food security. There are several types of food preservation. Our ancestors had many generations to develop prior to refrigeration, and a few that blossomed during the last couple of hundred years. Some types of preservation that can be utilized locally are salt curing, and I'll go into detail on each one of these to some extent, and then I'll go into a lot of detail on the last of fermenting. And freeze drying, canning, freezing, dehydrating, root cellar type of storage, and of course my favorite, fermenting. I'm going to start with salt curing and smoking. Something I haven't done a lot of salt curing. I've done some smoking. Haven't experimented a bunch with this, but there's several potentially useful applications that can be applied locally. The salt is used to dehydrate the item being preserved, depriving the bacteria of moisture necessary to propagate. Traditionally, fish has been preserved for long-term storage with the application of salt, such as herring, cod, and salmon are a few examples, which are cured either by a full immersion in salt or by being brined and then smoked. Bacon, ham, and jerky are a few other examples of useful applications that you can apply locally. I know of several folks that are growing hogs in this valley. Salt-cured herbs are one that I really I'm interested in experimenting with. I've seen where folks take fresh herbs, they shake them with rock salt, let them sit in that rock salt in a jar for an extended period of time, and eventually the salt will take on the characteristics and flavorings of the herbs. Then you can use it to salt your dishes. The next one is freeze drying, one I have not experimented. I'll just be brief on this one. Basically, it requires a dehydrating freezer, but this is a really good way for long-term preservation. Freeze drying works by freezing the material that you want to preserve, then you reduce the pressure and add a low heat to allow the frozen water in the product to change directly to vapor. Basically, it sublimates the moisture right out of it. You achieve a 99% dehydration on these. It's an excellent way for food preservation and for long-term storage. The next one, canning, is probably our most familiar way to preserve food. There are two basic types of canning: water bath and pressure canning. Pressure canning requires a pressure canner and can preserve low acid foods and meats. It's a little bit more technical, something I really haven't delved into. I know there's a lot of folks in this valley that do use that. Water bath and steam canning, which is what I've been playing around with. It just consists of boiling your jars of product long enough to kill spoilage mechanisms. This method works for high acid recipes with a pH of 4.5 or lower. The reason being that we're trying to avoid botulism, and botulism cannot exist in high acid environments. So this works great for making jams and jellies from our Western Slope fruits and berries. And such as I've got some local raspberry peach jam and some Western Slope peaches. Love getting those organic cases from our various folks that deliver. And you can make jams and jellies, and obviously you can store those for a year or so, and they're really nice to have throughout the year. And just so much better when you can have control over using organic products, if that's your choice, and organic sugars, and just making sure the ingredients are what you want, no preservatives. Then also you can make tomato-based products this way, such as tomato sauces, barbecue sauces, chutneys, and salsas. These are fairly easy to make, and the results can be really quite phenomenal. There's got some basic stuff like applesauce, one of our common ones, and we have tons of apples on the Western Slope. This is one I made from my garden. This is a zucchini chutney. So it's zucchini with apple cider vinegar and some sugar with chilies and onions and garlic and leeks and all kinds of other good stuff. Yes, Susan.
Jeff, I'm going to jump in real quick. If
Yes.
you will stop sharing your screen, we want to see you really big, and we want to see the preserved foods that you're holding up.
What do I need to do?
So you should have a green button that says stop sharing on your Zoom.
Yes.
Yeah, and it hits stop sharing, and then you'll be big and giant on all of our screen. Yeah, now we can see what you're showing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was told to share my screen at the beginning of this, and I didn't. That wasn't anything I discussed when I was shown how to do all this. So thank you.
Oh, sure. That's right, because a lot of folks brought PowerPoints, but you've brought the real deal. So it's all good.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you for correcting me on that. So back to what I was doing here. Let's see if I can get myself big so I can see what I'm showing you. There we go. All right. So here is this is a zucchini relish chutney, which is really yummy, and just a couple of other items. I just wanted to have a few props here. I've got a apple chutney, and then this is a barbecue sauce. So I know it's kind of hard to see with the glare and stuff, but point is this is something that just about anybody can do. I got to the point where I would come home from work and I'd like throw together a quick something or other and can it up in the course of making dinner. When you kind of work it into your schedule, it really becomes not such a big deal. It's not an all huge process. Of course, when you're doing your canning, I use a stock pot and a metal steamer. You can use a canning vessel with the screen. Make sure your jars are nice and sterilized. I just typically will stick them in my canning vessel and boil them for a few minutes and pull them out. The big thing is to make sure you boil your jars for 30 minutes. At our altitude, you need to boil them a little extra long because of the lower boiling temperature of water. And at sea level, of course, it's like 10 or 15 minutes for some of these things. So the supplies you need are just clean jars and lids, either pectin for your fruits stuff, and vinegar or lemon juice with sugar and spices. And it's really quite easy. So there's a couple of great online resources for canning safety and such. The Oregon State University has a website. Just Google food preservation or food canning and you'll get there, I guarantee it. They have tons of information and tons of information on the safety, so you can do it comfortably and know what you're doing. So I'm going to move on to freezing next. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, we can store a lot of different foods in our freezers, the obvious being frozen meat, especially from our bountiful local game. I'm sure a lot of you folks have elk and deer in your freezers. But beyond the obvious, you can freeze almost every fruit and vegetable. Fruits can be frozen as is without blanching or much processing other than just cleaning them. Vegetables need to be blanched prior to freezing to stop the production of enzymes. And so basically with a minimal amount of processing, you can stick them in the freezer and you can have this product to use all year round. I like to process my garden harvest into semi-finished culinary components. And so a few examples being blanched chopped greens. I'll take the greens off of my beets and use spinach and chard and collards, but all of your root vegetable greens work as well. You just take and give them a real fast blanch, a fast boil basically, and then pull them out, cool them off real quick by immersing them in ice water, draining, chop into portions and stick in the freezer. These are awesome for using for soups and sauces and other such things. And so that's just a really good way to preserve the greens, because greens won't last forever in your refrigerator, obviously. Marinara sauce is one. I actually was able to harvest about 60 pounds of tomatoes out of my small greenhouse here in CB South, even with the crazy summer we had and the September 8th blizzard and all that. I had bought a small greenhouse heater, and my tomatoes literally got to 6 feet tall, had tons of them. So I had to pick them all. Most of them are green when I picked them, and I just let them ripen in my back bedroom. And as they ripened, I would make different things out of them. So marinara sauce being one. I like to cook a real nice low acid marinara sauce, and using my processed tomatoes, get the seeds out, get the skins off, and then add garlic. And I like to grate vegetables into it, like beets, zucchini, and carrots. You could add, and they cook down really nicely. And then add leeks and onions, and of course garlic and olive oil. All of those items grow here except for the olive oil, obviously. And so basically you take your garden and you boil it down, you make a real nice marinara sauce, freeze it into portions, and you've got meals set up for pretty much the rest of the year. You can pull them out, thawed out, add some cooked meat, seafood, sauteed veggies, and then just toss with your favorite rice or pasta. An awesome way to store your hard-earned produce that you grew. And then onions and garlic and leeks, or any of the onion family, you can chop them, saute them, and then freeze them in portions and stick them in the freezer, and you can take them out and add them to whatever you want moving forward. And then of course, potatoes are really good as well. You can partially cook them first and cube them up and shred them, or cube them up and then blanch them, and then freeze those portions and use them for hash browns throughout the winter as well. So the next item is dehydrating. It's one of the oldest methods of food preservation. It's been used since the dawn of civilization. When you do a traditional dehydrate as opposed to the freeze-dried, you remove about 85 to 95% of the moisture instead of 99. So it's not going to be quite as shelf-stable, but they'll still last a good year or so. There's a few different types of dehydrating. You can sun dry. Traditionally, that's been a thing. It's mostly people sun dry fruits. You need a minimum of 86 degrees and a maximum of 60% humidity. Kind of a short season for us to sun dry that kind of stuff here, but it is doable in Gunnison County. Another form is air dry, either in shade outside, such as meats and stuff, things that are sensitive to the sun. You can picture the old Indian villages with racks of drying salmon and or buffalo. And herb bundles in the house. I dry herbs throughout the entire growing season and end up with a pretty good supply of them by the end. This one is probably pretty good for Gunnison if you keep the critters and the birds and stuff out of your product while you're trying to dry it. I like to sun dry mushrooms, specifically oyster mushrooms as well. It's a really nice way to dehydrate those. You can do food dehydration in your oven at 140 degrees. It's not optimal. You don't have the air circulation, but it is doable. And then, of course, the best is using one of the commercial electric dehydrators. Personally, I use one of these guys. This is a Nesco. It's got nice controls on the front. You're able to set your temperature and your time, walk away, and come back to a finished product. This is a real sweet thing to have. If you want to do food preservation, I highly recommend getting something similar to this. So basic principles of food dehydration is you need a low heat with a steady airflow, and you need that to inhibit the growth of bacteria, yeast, and mold growth. You have less nutrient loss than canning, so it's a healthier way to preserve food. And the correct temperature, of course, is fairly important. Herbs like a lower temperature of around 95 degrees, vegetables like 130, fruits around 135, and then meats 160 to 165, so you can pasteurize the product and make it safe. The biggest danger with food dehydration is not a high enough temperature or too high of a temperature. If it's too low, you'll leave that food in the danger zone for too long and you risk food spoilage. Whereas too high, you get what's called paste hardening, and the outside of your product gets kind of hardened, and then it keeps the inside from getting the moisture evaporated out, and then it will spoil on the inside. So another way to ensure that you don't have either of those issues is when you do food dehydration, make sure your product is uniform. You chop it to the same size and such. Also, be careful mixing items. When you have a stack of trays and different products, they will cross-contaminate each other with the flavors. Sometimes I do that strategically. I like to dry onions and tomatoes and chilies together because I like all those flavors together, and I like tomatoes with a little bit of onion and chili, and vice versa. So many things can be dried: fruits, chilies, veggies, legumes, meats, grains, and seafood and herbs. I personally like dried tomatoes and chilies. Some tomatoes out of my greenhouse. I grew a bunch of yellow pear tomatoes. These guys are super sweet. They're awesome in soups and sauces and stuff like that. They just add a whole new dimension of flavor when you're cooking. Onions out of my garden work really well. Then once again, you can chop them up or crunch them up and add them to all kinds of different, pretty much anything you want to add an onion to. You've got dehydrated onions. They are good to go. Some more tomatoes, just basic little or large cherry tomatoes that I dried, and these guys are also super sweet. They're also really good as a snack just to munch on. And of course, chilies, which I did not grow. These are from farmers market, and I use a lot of chilies in what I cook. So great way to preserve stuff. Things that do not dry well are fatty foods. Nut butters, avocados don't do well, olives, dairy, and eggs. So basically things with oils and fats. The fat inhibits the removal of that moisture. And dried foods will last 6 months to a year, possibly much longer if they're stored in a cool, dark place. I put mine, as you see, in mason jars. You can use vacuum seal if you choose. Just make sure your product's completely dry before putting it into your containers. If you have moisture left, then you run the risk of having it spoil or mold afterwards. I'm going to move on to root cellaring and cold storage. This is obviously a very traditional, long use method. Optimally, you'll go for about 32 to 40 degrees and about 90 to 95% humidity. Clearly, that's a challenge in our valley. We don't have much humidity here, but I think if you were to dig a hole and have a legitimate root cellar, you could probably get pretty close. But there are some alternatives to this scenario. I keep stuff in a cool bedroom, mostly my garlic. I grew about 500 heads of garlic a year because I love garlic. And I can keep my garlic and I use it all the way until the next harvest. It starts to sprout a little bit towards the end, but it still works just fine. You can also keep onions, potatoes, squash, melons, carrots, beets, apples, and cabbage. All these things can be stored in a root cellar. And a lot of these can be stored in a cool, dark room. Dark is important as well. I've read about recently, and I'm really interested in looking further into this one, about an African gentleman who discovered by packing fresh tomatoes in wood ash that they would stay in a root cellar for up to 6 months fresh. That's really fascinating to me, that you can actually preserve, a tomato for that long. So again, root cellaring, if you start to do the farming, is just a really good way. Obviously potatoes, if you have a good root cellar, you can keep potatoes for 9 months or so, possibly longer as well. And onions, I'm still using onions that Sue grew last year. So now I'm going to move on to fermentation. This is kind of my passion. Fermentation is a metabolic process, and it changes the chemical structure of organic substances via enzymes, oftentimes changing the structure into a far more shelf-stable and more bioavailable and nutritious product than you started with. Fermentation is used in many, many applications, far more than you might even suggest, or might realize, I mean. Obvious ones such as beer and alcohol, where you ferment grains to attain alcohol, is one of the main ones. But chocolate fermentation is integral into the production of chocolate. Yogurt is a fermented milk product. Kombucha is a fermented sugar and tea product. And then, of course, you have your cucumber pickles, your sauerkrauts, and kimchees, and all those sort of ferments. So fermenting actually removes some of the non-nutrients and creates new nutrients and vitamins where they weren't there before. And it creates many other beneficial things, including probiotics and nutritious acids and all kinds of good stuff. I hear that a lot of ranchers in our valley are fermenting their grains these days for better bioavailability of nutrients for a healthier livestock. So it's becoming, you know, pretty kind of semi-mainstream amongst the more savvy of ranchers and such. I started getting interested in ferments when my daughter and I decided to start making kombucha because we really liked drinking kombucha. And I did that about 11 years ago. And then in the course of that, you know, when I started realizing how interesting the process was, I started playing around with cabbage sprouts and just basic sauerkraut. And then once I figured out the chemistry of how it all worked, I realized I could ferment just about anything for long-term storage. And again, making stuff that's tastier than what you started with. Just a touch on kombucha briefly. It's basically a sweetened black tea that you initiate a SCOBY into, and then that ends up converting the sugars into acids and alcohol. And that SCOBY is basically a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. It looks like kind of a rubbery slime thing. Drop that on the top of your liquid, and it'll start to convert the liquid into a different substance. But I also discovered that making kombucha and fermenting vegetables doesn't really mix in the same household. They tend to have a tendency to cross-contaminate, and so I ended up just starting to do fermentation, and now I just buy my kombucha. So fermentation, with a few basic, a little bit of an investment, you can come up with a pretty fail-safe means to do it. I'm going to go into some of the supplies, and then I'll go into actually how to do it, and then show some of my finished product. So as far as a vessel for doing it, I tend to use these. This is called a Phyto Jar. They're made in Italy, and as you can see, they've got a snap top and a hinged lid, and then they have a rubber gasket that goes onto the lid and creates a seal. And so these things are awesome because they will self-release the gas during the ferment, because ferments do create fermentation and gas. And so you have to have a way for that gas to release. There's lots of different fermentation products out there with air gaps at the top and such. But I have found my favorite are Phyto. They're just simple, they're easy to use, and I have had 100% success. I have never lost a ferment in a Phyto Jar. Plus, they come in all kinds of different sizes. You've got little ones, so you can really kind of gauge exactly what you want to do. And so if you want to do a small ferment after work and go harvest a few things out of the garden, you can use a small jar. You got a head of cabbage, you can use a big jar, and you can literally fit a whole head of cabbage into one of these jars. And so a couple of other items you are very handy. This is a pounder for macerating and pushing in the cabbage for making sauerkraut. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well. I like to use some sort of container to put my ferment container in. That way, when it does bubble and overflow, you will definitely bubble out some brine during the process. I said Phyto, F-I-D-O is what kind of jars they are. See if we can get the actual name. I guess that's backwards, but they are a Phyto Jar. And so yes, having a container underneath them is good because I always end up emptying out extra brine as the ferment progresses. And then a couple of other items. One of these canning doohickeys. It's nice just to help get the product into the jars without making too big of a mess. And then these are weights. And these are a glass weight. And so you can put that on top of your ferment when you put it into the jar. Again, I'll go into a little bit more detail. It's very important that when you do a fermentation that you keep everything under the brine best that you can. So two main types of vegetable fermentations that are out there are self-brining and brined ferments. Self-brining is when you just add salt to your vegetable and the vegetable creates its own liquid. So of course, sauerkraut is the most common of these and the easiest to make. It usually just consists of salt and cabbage. You might not realize that when you taste a fermented sauerkraut, there's no vinegar in there. It's just salt and cabbage. It makes its own sour. And so here in Gunnison County, cabbage grows pretty decently, as does kohlrabi and rutabagas. The rabi kraut was a very popular production item for the Slavic miners that were in here in the early days. They used to grow kohlrabis, and they used to make, I hear they used to make rabi kraut in their bathtubs, is so the story goes. So basically, you just take a certain, well, the formula to get your salt into the sauerkraut is basically a weight of product versus a weight of salt. And so the formula that I use is 5 to 6 grams of salt per pound of product or cabbage, if you may. That will equate to about a 2% brine. I'll go into details on the next section on what a percentage brine means. So the recipe basically to make sauerkraut is you shred cabbage and you toss it with the weighted amount of salt as per the weight of cabbage. And then you let it sit for 10 to 20 minutes to draw out some moisture, and then you pack it tightly into your fermentation vessel. And then you put your fermentation vessel in a cool, dark place for 3 weeks and enjoy the bountiful harvest at the end of that. Important things with fermenting, again, is you want to keep your substance under the brine. I will say when you make sauerkraut with a self-brining substance, once you pack it into the jar, you want to leave a little headspace. I usually pack about up to here, and it will, as it creates its brine, it will actually expand and it will fill the rest of the jar up with a brine, and it eventually overflow into the, hopefully, container that you have to catch that. And so the key here is you don't want to make it too full, or it'll literally spew out all of its brine and you'll have a dry ferment. Or if you make it too empty, you have too much headspace. And if you have too much headspace, it leaves room for oxygen or air, and that can cause spoilage. Now, the thing I like about these Phyto containers is once I put my ferment in here and put my weight on top, I seal it up. I don't open this until three weeks has gone by, and it will sit there and off gas. You can hear it kind of go as time goes by. And in doing so, I create an anaerobic atmosphere inside of my ferment chamber, which means no oxygen. It's mostly, I think, carbon dioxide and other gases. And that keeps, even if you have stuff above the level of the brine, I have found using Phyto jars, nothing ever spoils. I never get mold. I never get anything. These things are awesome. A little cautionary side note, it is in fact possible. So I've read that these are capable of exploding. Some people are real nervous about it, and they'll sit there and they'll just let a little bit of gas out every so often, especially in the first few weeks when the ferment is most active. But again, I've done at least 50 of these. I've never had one explode. Yes, it's a possibility. I prefer just to leave them alone, and I think that's a lot to do with my success in not having them go bad. So if you read about fermenting, especially like sauerkrauts, you'll see some folks do open container ferments or ferments that have some kind of well or something. But honestly, in Gunnison County, I feel like you really need to seal your ferments because our lack of humidity tends to dehydrate them significantly, and you'll lose they'll basically get oxidized on the top. So do do it. Sorry, I looked at the question and got distracted. So yeah, leave them alone. It's best, and then open them when you're all done. Now, once they're done after 3 weeks, I take them and then I'll jar them into mason jars and just put them in the refrigerator. They'll literally last, up to a year. I've got here's a sauerkraut that I made that has carrots and garlic in it. And this I jarred on March 22nd of 2020. And this stuff, I guarantee, is as yummy as it gets, and it's a year old. So once you figure out the basic formula with sauerkraut, then you can start experimenting with additions. And like that one, I put carrots and garlic in. I love that sauerkraut in sandwiches. It's really good in place of lettuce, and it just gives, you know, that sour crunchy on your sandwich. It's really good. I have made chili ginger sauerkrauts. I like putting fresh apples into my sauerkraut. It makes for a really nice sweet one. Tends to make it ferment a little bit faster, and that's awesome with pork and that kind of stuff. And then of course you have the Asian influence sauerkraut or kimchi, if you like. So cabbage, all these items, they grow really well in Gunnison County. So this is just a really good product that we can use for food preservation here. So kimchis are kind of one of my favorite things to play around with. I like spicy food. I love ginger. I love garlic. Authentic kimchi typically will have Napa cabbage is the main ingredient. Then it will have rice flour, some type of seafood, chili paste, lots of garlic and ginger. Now with me, I simplified a little bit. I basically make a kimchi flavored sauerkraut. I leave out the rice flour and the seafood. I use lots of garlic and ginger, fresh turmeric if I have it, and then Napa cabbage. That Sue has grown a lot of really nice Napa cabbages. So such as, here's one of my my kimchis with some of Sue's Napa cabbage. And then I'll go in my garden and I'll look and see what is ready to be picked. I add turnips, bok choy, radishes, leeks, carrots, green onions, chives, and of course lots of garlic. Fresh chili is always good, any kind of chilies. If you don't have fresh, you can use dried. This particular one I showed you, I actually use some chili powder in as well. And then fresh turmeric if you like it, or if you like it and you can find it, of course. If you like it fishy, you can always add a little bit of fish sauce to the mixture. And then what I'll do is like the cabbage, I'll go and chop up all my ingredients. I tend to chop them a bit coarser. Then I do the sauerkraut. Sauerkraut I usually shred, but the kimchi I'll chop into large chunks. I really like the big chunky pieces of the end parts of the Napa cabbage are just really, I mean, they're so full of flavor and juice and so yummy. I like to have big chunks of those. And so basically I'll get all my food prepped and cleaned, and then I'll weigh it. And then I'll, however many pounds, I'll add the 5 to 6 grams of salt to that mixture and toss it all together. And just like sauerkraut, pack it into a jar. And I don't smoosh it quite as much, but I do smoosh it so that I try to remove all the air when I pack it into my jar, and then let it sit for 3 weeks and jar it up. And yeah, and then you end up, oh, where to go, with a really yummy jar. So I basically was making like a batch of these every couple of weeks. I'd buy a head or two of Napa cabbage from Sue, go in my garden and pick some turnips and some radishes and leeks and onions and all that kind of good stuff. And every batch was a little different, and every one was an experiment. And I have yet to have one that was bad. I had one that was super, super gingery, almost medicinal, but man, they're all really, really good. So again, you can pack this stuff, and this stuff lasts for a good solid year. So another one that I really like are sour pickles. Cucumbers, as I discovered last summer, you can grow in your greenhouse around here. I probably harvested maybe 10 or 15 pounds of cucumbers. And they're so much better than the vinegar-based brined pickles. We call them those dead pickles. Ours are live pickles. These work best with a 3 to 3.5% brine. So we're moving into a brined ferment as opposed to the self-brining of the cabbages and brassicas. Brined ferments are when you take a vegetable, process it, put it into a jar, add a brine over the top, and you let that ferment. And so we talk about percent brines. Usually we use between a 2% and a 10%, depending on what we're fermenting. 2% is very common. For sauerkrauts and that and brassica type of stuff, meaning the broccolis, cabbage, cauliflower, rutabagas, all those are brassicas, and they basically will ferment excellently with 2%. And if you do the 5 to 6 grams of salt per pound of product, you'll end up with approximately a 2% brine. So pickles like a 3 to 3.5% brine. So how we determine this is when we make our brine, we take a liter of water, or 1,000 milliliters if you like, and we add 30 grams of salt. That gives us a 3% brine. If we want a 2% brine, we add 20 grams of salt to a liter of water. 5% brine, 50 grams of salt per liter of water. Pretty basic stuff. And I have a chart that I can share at some point if you contact me after the thing of all these things. It works really well. And so I make a 3.5% brine for my pickles. When I make my pickles, I take the cucumbers. I prefer smaller, firm ones. If you get large ones, they tend to be mushy in the middle. The ones I grew myself turned out to be by far the best of all the pickles I made. I bought a bunch of cucumbers at the farmers markets. Some worked out really good. Some of them got a little mushy in the middle, but all the ones I grew myself were all absolutely crisp. So you take and you cut the blossom end off just a little bit because that's a spot that will also get soft. Put them into a container, top them with cold water, refrigerate overnight. Soaking those cucumbers in water overnight helps to keep them super crispy when you do your ferment. And then when you actually get to the point of putting together your ferment, you take all of your dill, your garlic, chilies if you want to use them, put that into the bottom of the Phyto Jar, pack your cucumbers on top of that, and then you add your 3 to 3.5% brine on top of that. Top that with a horseradish leaf, and I'll go into that scenario in a little bit, and then cover it up and cool dark place for 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how sour you like those pickles. And man, then they'll be the best pickles you've ever had, I guarantee it. And again, smaller cucumbers work best. Soak overnight in cold water. Put the spices in the bottom so it doesn't float to the top, and then top with a horseradish leaf. The reason for that is it's good to add something with tannins into the mixture. Tannins help keep the things crisp. And things that have tannins in there that you can use are oak leaves, grape leaves. I've seen people use bay leaves, but horseradish leaves I have found work awesome. And horseradish grows really, really too good in Gunnison. If you go to plant some, make sure you plant it in a contained area because it will completely take over whatever area you put it in. All you need is one little root, stick it in the ground, and you'll be hard pressed to kill that stuff. So again, I highly recommend horseradish for these sort of ferments. And I've gotten to the point where I cover every ferment I do with a horseradish leaf that's a brined ferment because it keeps all the ingredients underneath the brine, put the weight on top of the horseradish leaf and their big leaves as well. It's just like the perfect solution. So once you figure out how to make cucumbers, you will realize that you can pretty much ferment any vegetable out of your garden that is green-based, not starch-based, and with this technique. And 3.5% brine will take care of most items. So things that I have fermented this way are carrots and beets, anything out of the brassica family, broccoli and cauliflower, all that kind of stuff works well. Onions, leeks, asparagus, or any combination of those. And then you add herbs, garlic, ginger, and chilies. And man, they just make awesome snacks, good kid snacks, and they're probiotic. They're super healthy. Yes, they have salt, but if you're not eating the pre-processed stuff from the grocery store, you're probably not maxing out your salt intake anyways. And then one of my favorites is cherry bombs. These are tomatoes, and these take a 5% brine, which is a little saltier, but I take cherry tomatoes, put garlic and some herbs, and man, these things are an explosion of flavor. Sue will let you know. I gave her a jar. I think pretty sure she'd enjoyed those pretty well. These are a pickled green tomato. Now I did these just like I would a cucumber ferment. Has fresh dill, it's got green tomatoes, and they're just like a canned pickled green tomato, but even better and probiotic. So another awesome product that you can do. And then to top it all off, this one blew my mind. These are radishes that Sue Wyman planted in October and harvested in January of this year. And I traded her a bunch for some ferments and fermented these, and these are absolutely delicious. I put a couple slices of beets in there to give it that nice color. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a ferment that I made in January with fresh picked produce in Gunnison. That is amazing to me. So as far as resources go, this is the book that I started out with. And again, it looks backwards, but I'll decipher Sander Katz's Wild Fermentation. It's a really good book just to give you a great basic starting point. Some of the techniques he uses in here probably are not appropriate for Gunnison just due to the simple fact of our humidity. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of things you can grow in this county that you can ferment. And it's just a great way to do food preservation. So in conclusion, as I'm sure you are realizing, you can grow more than one may have ever thought here locally with a bit of effort. Once you realize the many ways you can preserve your hard-earned produce, you realize you have much more control over your food security than you may have previously thought. You will also look upon our bountiful farmers markets in a much different light than you did previously. As you see, when you see all that good stuff, you can realize, hey, I can put that up and be eating that food all year long. So Sue, I really hope you plant lots of Napa cabbages this year. And I really hope that I inspire at least a couple folks to go and make themselves some ferments this summer. And so now I'm going to open this up for questions and see how this all works.
Great. And Jeff, I'm happy to help moderate the questions, and that is read them to you from the Q&A. And
that would be perfect.
And my cherry bombs are gone. They were so good. they're gone. And I'm definitely inspired, and we'll be watching this video several times on the YouTube channel. One question came in, and Augustina asked, how cool of a cool, dark place can sauerkraut ferment in? Would it be okay in a wine cellar or root cellar?
Well, when you're doing the actual fermentation, I started by doing it on my counter. So I've done it as high as 70 degrees. The higher the temperature, the faster your ferment will go. So that is something that you'll kind of learn from experience of doing it. I keep mine now I have a bedroom that I keep at 60 degrees where I keep all of my root cellar stuff and all my canned goods. And that's where I do my ferments now. So 60 degrees, I've got the window blocked off so I don't get any light in there. So hopefully that answers your question. Anywhere from 60, below 60, you're probably not going to get much of a fermentation. You need at least 60 to ferment. I think 60 to 70 is optimal temperature for fermentation.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question, this actually comes from me, and you may have covered this. Now, do you typically can the sauerkraut and kimchi after it leaves the Phyto Jar? Or do you just take it out of the Phyto Jar and pack it into your mason jar and then keep it in the refrigerator or a different cool space? Just can you clarify?
Yes, that is, and the answer to that is yes to both. So personally, I take and can my stuff into mason jars, and I say can, I put them into mason jars and I put a lid on it and I put it in the refrigerator. Now, if you choose to do so, you can hot water bath these and can them and make them shelf stable. This is an option. Personally, I do not do this because once you do that, you lose all the probiotic goodness out of the ferment. And so I prefer to keep the probiotics alive, and so I refrigerate my ferments. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yes. Another question came in from Jeff Bivens, and Jeff asks, in what situation can the lid on the mason jar not be reused?
For canning, I always use fresh lids for canning, just to be safe. I know of people who use lids. Personally, I wouldn't do that. I like to be safe. I want my canned goods, not my ferments, my canned goods to be good. So then after I use that canned good, I use those lids for my ferments. So they do get reused. They just don't get used for canning.
Perfect. We have room for, we have one more minute before our lunch break. Jeff, your timing was perfect. in this last minute, does anyone else have any burning questions that they need to ask? And I will jump in and say we're going to capture a few of Jeff's recipes for the recipe book. The chart that he mentioned, we will send out by email. And then there was talk in the chat about perhaps a group order of Phyto Jars through the guild so that we can all kind of jumpstart and not have to have individual Amazon boxes or shipping boxes. Let's work.
That's an awesome idea.
Yeah, work collaboratively. That's what this whole conference is about. So it is now 11:45. Jeff is going to say goodbye for lunch. I'm sure you can reach out to him later. And Dan is going to play the loop while we all just take half an hour for a lunch break. Remember that if you want to switch over to track 2, you have the link from Dana that came in earlier today. And enjoy lunch, and we'll see everyone at 12:15. And in this track this afternoon, we have backyard gardening and seed saving. So we'll see you all back in about 29 minutes. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And bye.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Where are we offline?
No, you're still online. We can all see you. We're just.
Oh, okay. You just went to the slideshow. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's the first time I've ever done anything like this. So hopefully I was able to give some information that helped or inspired somebody.
And all up and organizing and everything. I said that earlier, but I was on mute.